Okay, welcome back to the podcast. This is episode number 164 with my guest, Andy Narell. This is Andy's third time on the podcast. Andy is a steel drummer, performer, educator, pedagogue, general wealth of information around the history of the instrument and its music and its culture. I had a good time chatting with Andy a little bit about the origins of the history of the steel drum as it pertains to sort of Trinidad's particular history with, colonization and oppression. So neither of us are historians, so most of this is anecdotal, so take that for what it's worth. But I hope you enjoy this conversation. I always enjoy chatting with Andy. So without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, Andy Narell. All right, we'll talk to you soon. Take care.
You know, it's not Labrie, I'll tell you. But it's surprising how close to normal things are here.
I was just thinking about, it dawned on me as I was logging on. I was like, oh yeah, Andy's in France. And the U.S. just got put on that travel ban list to the EU.
Yeah.
And pardon my ignorance, but St. Lucia's not, is that, what territory is that?
St. Lucia's an independent country.
Independent, okay.
Yeah, it was before it was independent. It was British.
Got it. Okay.
But the British and French fought over St. Lucia, and they exchanged control of it 14 times. They each had it 7 times in the course of the fight.
Well, I want to get into this. I'm glad that you sort of just went deep on some very specific knowledge on some of this stuff, because it's literally what I want to talk to you about today. If you're all right with this. This is your third time back on the podcast, and I'm really, really, really grateful for this. I saw, sadly, too late that you were on the Arranger's Corner with Andre and those fellas, and I'm really bummed I missed it. But I've noticed a real. Go ahead, sorry.
No, I was just saying it was fun.
Yeah, those guys, that Arranger's Corner thing, and Andre, just the way they're all. I like Quint Rose. Was Quint Rose on that call as well?
I don't think so. Maybe at some point, but he didn't talk.
And then there's the Ramajay.
Kareem was there and Khan was there.
Yeah. And then there's the Ramajay competitions that have been happening online, which have been awesome, like Concordis and Andre and all, to see all them play. And anyway, it just seems like there's a really great chatter happening specifically right now, maybe more so than I'm used to seeing, and I'm really psyched about it. But there's also a big conversation right now happening in the world. It's been happening for a long time, but in really intense ways following the murder of George Floyd, around oppression and systemic oppression and what it looks like, what it doesn't look like, what it does to societies, what are the ramifications hundreds of years later, how do we fix it, those sorts of things. And you posted a long list of books and just resources about that you've come across. Immediately triggered for me when I was in Trinidad as a student. I took with me, just because I was a nerd, I'm like, I'm going to take a Trinidad book with me, and I read The Loss of El Dorado by V.S. Nepal, and was sort of like, that was the first time for me where I was in a country reading about some sort of historical context around what was happening, and it dawned on me then as a 19-year-old that Sir Walter Raleigh had a hand in the steel drums, whether he knew it or not. And it's, for me, it's fascinating to think about this stuff. And the steel drum in particular was born out of the very oppression and systemic governmental sort of oppression that we're all that's in the air right now. And I'm kind of curious, just to bounce off of that book list that you have, and just maybe this little prompt I'm setting up. I think a lot of students, myself included, went through high school playing in steel bands, sort of, even though we're close to the historical catalysts that brought this to us, relatively speaking, compared to the violin or the piano maybe, it somehow is disjointed from the historical context from which it came. I could play in a steel drum band in a high school and have zero idea that, Cliff Alexis was beat over the head by a cop in Trinidad for playing pan as a kid, and I'm just kind of curious, it's important to me for folks to know that, and I'm curious if you can sort of walk me through, maybe we can do it together, what is the historical context behind the steel band and the steel drum? We talked a little bit about Anthony Williams, but we jumped to sort of how he influenced the panorama, but I kind of want to go back before any of this and talk a little bit about the complexities of what, like you said, the British fought over St. Lucia 14 times or something. Trinidad changed hands from the Dutch, the Spanish, the French. Plantations needed to be run, and the colonizers at the time weren't good at it, so they brought and then the indentured servitude from like it's so messy. And I'm just kind of curious. I know in an hour and 10 minutes, it's impossible to do that thoroughly, but for you, I'm kind of curious to hear what your thoughts are on the sort of context behind what brought the steel band as it relates to, oppression and that sort of stuff. That was very long-winded, Andy. I'm sorry.
Ooh, that was a long question.
Yeah. I know it's thorny, and again, like there's a lot of ways to talk about this stuff, but I kind of want to keep it specific to the steel band in particular.
Right. Well, first of all, just to get off your specific question a little bit, I just want to mention I actually read all those books. I didn't come across all.
Oh
those
yeah,
books.
that was clear to me. I didn't. It didn't even dawn on me that you would just like here's a list of books I've never even read.
I wasn't going to recommend books that I hadn't read just because I know that they're cool. I mean, it's like no, this is This
I had a bunch of books to recommend too, but I truthfully I've only ever read the V.S. Nepal book. I'm like obsessed with quantum mechanics, so the vast majority of my books are like about quantum entanglement. Like not even related to steel drums, so it's like it didn't feel right to post those up in addition to the V.S. Nepal book. So I just left it to you. You did a great job.
That reminds me of another interesting book. You ever read Coming of Age in the Universe?
Mm-mm. Who's it about?
Timothy Ferris, I'm going to say.
Okay,
but I'm not sure.
I'll write that down.
It's a book about it's a history of how we got to where we are now in terms of our understanding of where we are in the universe, but from scratch, from the point where we didn't know anything, when guys were just staying up all night looking at the stars trying to figure it out. Mm-hmm. And now you go to school, you learn all this stuff.
Well,
but
theoretically, you're supposed to have learned it.
This is attained knowledge.
Yeah.
Anyway, I think back to your question. For me, just to put it in a larger perspective, we have this incredible, rich culture of music. If we look at the African experience in the Americas, this is like the source of so much incredible music, and it's all over the country. Just in the U.S., the African-American experience, the Africans' experience in America led to spirituals and gospel and R&B and jazz and Motown and everything we know as popular music in America and rap and hip hop and all this, and that's just us, that's just, and I didn't say every part of it, then you go south and it's just every country, you find something different happened. It was a different mix of Europeans with a different mix of Africans and whoever else came in all these different islands, and each one produced a unique musical culture. You look at Cuba and the vast richness of Cuban music. And then you go over to Haiti and it's huge, and the Dominican Republic and Puerto Rico. That's a huge swath of Afro-Caribbean music right there. And you head down to the French Caribbean and Martinique and Guadeloupe. It's just an amazing musical culture. And Trinidad, the whole calypso and steel band music, and it's all and I skipped Jamaica. These are the big hubs.
Lest we forget about Jamaica.
And Brazil is 100 different styles of music. And then you have the rest of South America and. I mean, every country has a unique musical culture, and it all has to do with the Africans. The Venezuelan music that'll really get you is Afro-Venezuelan music. The Peruvian music that's going to get you is the Afro-Peruvian music. I'm telling you, it's like that everywhere. They used to have, Oscar Stagnaro and Paquito de Rivera. They were big on that. Always talking about because Oscar was from Peru and he knew all this Afro music from all over South America. And so they used to talk about that stuff a lot. And they used to give Dario Eskenazi shit because he was from Argentina where they didn't have Africans. And so there's no Afro-Argentinian music. They got the tango. And that was, whereas in Peru they had black people, and so Oscar felt
Right,
he had a superior background
and
in the musical culture
just
behind
to
it.
state the obvious for folks, maybe who are just learning about like the African diaspora in the Caribbean, at least as far as Trinidad is concerned, was slave driven, like slavery driven. They didn't, Africans didn't just come to Trinidad just for the hell of it.
Hmm.
Like it was, they were brought here, and so that, when you mentioned like spirituals and hymns, a lot of the way those came out, if I'm not mistaken, Andy, you can please correct me here, is it was a mode of communication amongst each other, oftentimes using slang and innuendo. Calypso music, by its definition, is innuendo based, like in the way that it's often politically motivated. A lot of slang terms that politicians might not understand, but everybody in the neighborhood does.
Hmm.
It was a way to hide a form of communication from your oppressor, and how that then became, like you said, popular music in the United States. Like it's in such a short amount of time. To me, that is interesting to sort of plot those data points along the way. Just thinking, like I said at the beginning, Walter Raleigh, coming to Trinidad and forcing people to look for gold. Christopher Columbus doing the same thing. They were looking for gold in Venezuela. Trinidad was just a doormat, to get to the Orinoco River.
Hmm.
But it's just crazy to think that like those decisions, I don't know. It's just how to untie all that from, detangle all that from our history is really tricky.
Yeah, and I mean, I think with Trinidad, each of those, I wanted to mention those other places because
Please.
they each have their own story.
Mm-hmm.
This is not one story like what happened to African people in the Caribbean.
Mm-hmm.
It's different. Every country, every island had their own experience, and Trinidad had a relatively shorter experience with slavery than some of the other islands, and then they brought in they brought in Africans kind of late in the game, and then they ended slavery, and they had another system called indentured servitude where they brought over Indians and Chinese who worked as if like slaves for 7 years, and then they'd earn their freedom.
Mm-hmm.
They were paying for their passage essentially.
Mm-hmm.
Was what the way the British framed the deal.
Yeah, that's indentured servitude is a time-honored tradition. That one,
Yeah.
that one's been used.
Well, you had to find some kind of replacement for slavery. That it's like in America they found sharecropping. It was the same thing.
Yeah, yeah.
And Jim Crow. So here, and then there were Trinidad also had. I believe there were free West Africans who also came over later. So not everyone is descended from slaves. In that sense, and it's a different and unique history, but the colonial powers were what they were. It was like basically we're here to govern these people and make them work for us so we can make profit on this thing. Interestingly enough, in the history of the Caribbean, what the most way back, what the most profitable colony was in all of the when you consider the U.S. colonies and the whole Caribbean. It was Haiti. Okay. Haiti was the highest profit colony in the whole region. It outproduced all the 13 colonies.
And what was their main? Was it sugar or
everything? Everything grew there. It was called the jewel of the French Empire.
Wow. Okay.
And they destroyed it. They destroyed it to keep. That's a longer story. That'll be a sidetrack.
Mm-hmm.
But Adam Hochschild wrote a really good book called. All his books are amazing,
okay.
And one of the one everybody knows is called King Leopold's Ghost. It's about the Congo, but this one is called Bury the Chains, and it's about the fight to end slavery. And you learn a lot of history of slavery in the Caribbean from this book. It's interestingly enough, he portrays it as having started with a dozen people in a room in London who decided they were going to bring down slavery, and they invented grassroots organizing. These people. It took about 40 years, but they actually succeeded in doing it. So it's an amazing story.
I'm curious. So just to talk about like trying to empathize with if I were a colonizer, like putting myself in the mindset of a British government at the time slavery is freed or slavery is ended in Trinidad, right? You have a population of people that have been historically oppressed and abused, and now they're essentially free. So I could imagine the fear that would be running rampant in the government. So you then implement measures like banning public gatherings, banning certain types of music played in public. I've heard the sort of like the banning of music in Trinidad as being like the main one of the big catalysts that then sort of pushed people into the discovery mode of, you know, transferring rhythms from, you know, traditional drums to bottles and spoons, which then landed on biscuit tins, which then led to the steel drums. Can you talk a little bit about the moments leading up to, I've always heard it anecdotally and I don't know the exact date, but like what was the sort of climate in Trinidad leading up to the moment when the British government decided to sort of put a crackdown on public gatherings and stuff like that?
No, I'm not an expert on that moment.
I'm not
I thought
either.
you were going to ask me to get specific about the birth of Pan, which I could talk more about.
Yeah, well, sorry, yes, that is my main question. And as I've heard the birth of Pan, to me, I've heard it tangentially or anecdotally connected to this moment of like the British government banning stuff. So I'm not a historian. I'm just asking based on what little anecdotes I have.
Yeah, I'm not sure which date we're talking about there, so I'm not going to venture to guess. I forgot. You know,
it's like 18. I want to say like the late 1850s or something like that. It was in that ballpark.
Sounds right. You know, and you know, basically, you know, I mean, this, you know, they had the city in the days when Pan was born. They had the city pretty well segregated. You know, they had like there was only one bridge across the Dry River, and everybody east of the Dry River, up in Laventille and Belmont and all that stuff, they were blocked from coming in. They could be controlled from coming into town. And you had to go over this one bridge. You know where Desperados were Cadiz Road.
Mm-hmm. I've never been up there, but I know of it. Yeah.
No, not the old place up in the hills where they were rehearsing down by the Savannah.
Okay.
They were rehearsing at the corner of the east side of the Savannah, and I think it's called Cadiz Road.
Okay.
All right, and it comes down from the hills, and there's a bridge over the Dry River right there, and there are pan yards right next to it. And I believe that's where the bridge was. That's what I've been told. And it was like a penny to go over the bridge, but they also gave them a measure of control. And that's why they call all that area behind the bridge.
Right. Which is the title of
that's what it came to be known as. What?
My introduction to you as a player was from your album that was titled Behind the Bridge.
So it refers to that whole area to the right side, you know, of the Dry River. And you know, Pan was born. It wasn't. It's amazing. It didn't just happen in one place. It didn't just happen with one person. You know, it just sort of happened simultaneously. A bunch of people got into it. I think Kim Johnson's book has some amazing photos. Kim, you don't know about this book yet?
I've heard.
It's out of print, but
I'm just writing it down.
It's called The Illustrated Story of Pan, and it's coming. Second edition's coming out in the next 6 months or something like that. He's trying to get it printed now. He had a crowdfunding to get it going, and it's one incredible. Kim got everybody from all over the world to send him pictures. He had close to 2,000 photos, I think, to choose from, and some wonderful photos of the early days of Pan before there were any notes on the pans. Just guys beating biscuit tins and pots and pans and just anything, and bands we never heard of, like the Gonzalez Rhythm Section and stuff like that. You know, that didn't become actual steel bands that we know. But some of the steel bands that we do know go all the way back.
Well, you mentioned that
days of rhythm.
You mentioned when we were talking about your the development of the panorama since 1962 that like you mentioned that the steel band is first a rhythmic ensemble and then second became a pitched ensemble. Like the initial steel bands were rhythm sections. That,
right.
You know, developed into what we know now as the pitched sort of.
Yeah, definitely. And, you know, the first thing was kind of the natural differentiation in pitch in a rhythmic situation where you'd have some instruments higher pitched and then some bass, you know, just like we have bigger and smaller drums. Neville Jules and I took a walk around downtown Port of Spain, and he pointed over to a place over by the Dry River. He said, "That right over there." He said, "That's where I first heard pan." And what he was talking about was just guy beating biscuit tin, you know. When he says, "I heard pan," you know, but he called it that already, you know, and so. You know, and the social conditions were such that, you know, we're still back to the colonials are in charge. It's just white people in charge. They're British. They act all superior. They're trying to educate us poor Africans and stuff like that. You know, like Sparrow. This was quite a bit later, but you ever heard the song "Dan is the Man"? Mm-hmm. And it makes, I don't know if you'd ever listen closely to the words, but it makes fun of.
Isn't that the Panorama tune that that North Stars played? Is that right?
Yeah, they did.
Yeah.
But it's mocking, the whole song mocks the English educational system by talking about the first grade readers that they gave these kids in Trinidad to read. Now it's what's funny about it is we read a lot of the same stuff in the U.S. at that time, you know. Yeah. So most of the titles are just like, you know, yeah, we know that too, you know.
Dan is the
Winkin', blinkin', and nod, and the cow jumped over the moon, and all this kind of stuff.
It's Good Night Moon now. Now, Good Night Moon is the now popular.
And they lived in a wooden shoe and all this kind of stuff. Yeah. So, these were the poor kids, like socially. These are on the whole ladder of Trinidad society. These are not like the middle class blacks or the educated blacks. These were the kids who were poorer and had less education and tended to be only African, not Indian, not Chinese. They weren't involved in the beginning. It was a black thing. And they were the guys in the steel band were from a social caste that was basically seen as a bunch of tough guys in gangs. And that's how they saw themselves, and that's how everybody else saw them.
I don't want to interrupt you, but there's something that has come up several times in my discussions, just talking about similar stuff to Quint Rose. I made a sort of, I quipped jokingly about, like, man, it's like, it's weird to me that I feel like, as a white guy, I feel oddly more comfortable in a steel band than I do sometimes in my own contemporary music world. Even though I, by and large, traffic more often in the sort of Carnegie Hall so percussion world. And Quint, like, without stopping, he's like, well, it's not a race thing, it's a class thing. Like, steel bands have historically been like lower class, and the culture of lower classes is different than the culture of the middle and, like, as you go higher. And it was interesting to me to think about the steel band in that light rather than thinking of it as a race thing purely, you know. And it not that it explained away everything, but it was like, oh, that's of course, like, it's a class thing, you know. The steel drum is a lower class. I mean, historically, it comes from a lower class.
Yeah, but I think it's oversimplifying it to put it that way, because what happened, that's where it came from, you know. But you generalize, you could even generalize it to the point saying, well, yeah, because steel band is a gang thing, you know, because that's where it came from. You know, that's a good point. And no, it's not. It came out of that. And what happened as steel bands became more popular, they also became more inclusive. And it was a social transformation within the culture of steel band that affected the entire society, because when steel bands became inclusive and started to include lighter skinned people and Indian people and white people and middle class people and upper class people, and the steel band started to include that, well, hey, society wasn't like that. Those people weren't interacting with each other out there in the world. You know, upper class society was never that inclusive. White people weren't accepting black people, and they weren't accepting the Indians. They were looking down on them. You know, upper class, and you still have that in Trinidad. You have a real class thing in Trinidad. But the steel bands broke through that, and they broke through it from below. You know, they came up and they elevated themselves, and then they started including everybody else, and they transformed their society. Well, not only themselves, but their whole society.
It's really, I mean, you're helping me clarify my views on what class and how it relates. I mean, it's not the only thing, but it is part of it. And it's like bubbling up, poking up from below is something that that lower classes have the sort of exclusive ability to do. You can't poke up from below when you're on top, like that's not how it works.
Well, I think also I would suggest that you consider the possibility that the reason you like it is because it's of the sense of inclusiveness.
Yes, that's
that everyone's invited, and this is something that breaks down barriers between people. This steel band culture, steel band culture is breaking down the barriers between white and black, and Indian and Chinese, and white and Indian, and old and young, and amateur men and women, and amateur and professional.
Yeah.
It's breaking down all those barriers, and whereas this other environment that you're talking about, that you feel in many ways less comfortable, even though you're part of it, it's like, yeah, it's very elitist.
It feels that way.
Very elitist. It's one of the reasons. It's not like steel band music.
Well, it's one of the reasons I feel like I wanted to talk with you specifically about this stuff, because I mean, everybody's trying to figure this stuff out in their own way, but I've been just trying to figure out, like, why do I feel so welcome in Trinidad or in Brooklyn, but I feel like as the privileged white guy, I have to fight harder to feel welcome in this other world that it's just something in my head I've had this cognitive dissonance with since I went to grad school, and realized, and I was the only guy at Yale that played steel drums. I mean, it's not like I was oppressed. It wasn't a struggle. It was like, oh wow, that's a weird data point to notice how everybody here sees the way I've been seeing this thing I've been making assumptions about. Can you talk a little bit about?
Well, I was the only guy that played pan at UC Berkeley too.
Yeah, I mean, it's been
way back in the day,
It's odd to be a unicorn in some areas and just sort of notice how other people notice, I guess. When you talk about, was there a conscious, like you sort of said that ending slavery was like, there was a story about it being 12 people in a room who made a decision. When the decision to sort of make steel bands, or the idea of the steel band, more inclusive, was there one person or one band that really started that movement, or was it just an organic thing that happened naturally?
By the way, just to go back to something you just said, those 12 people, they had no power. Those 12 people who decided to bring it down. They what was the task in front that they set for themselves, in front of themselves, bringing down slavery at that point, at the end of the 18th century, would be considered like you and I sitting in a room with some friends and saying, we're going to take down the corporations. It was considered that impossible.
That much of a long shot.
That much of a long shot when they started. And they swayed public opinion to the point where it happened. But anyway, so what was your question? Back to your...
So in Trinidad, like you mentioned, that I agree. I mean, steel bands have felt inclusive, but there was a point where they weren't, where, like you said, it was mostly, ill-behaving men in gangs or whatever. As it developed, was there one band or one group that was sort of like the band that first had women, the band that first had Indians, or like, was there some pioneer on that front to really drive the inclusivity, or was it something that just happened organically across the island because that's the way sometimes things happen?
Well, I think to give credit where credit is due, I can't exactly answer your question, but to backtrack a little and give some credit where it's due. In the 1950s, before the bands became inclusive, the women went for it anyway. The women said, we want to play. They were excluded, and they formed their own bands. Mm-hmm. And there was a whole bunch of all-female steel bands in the 50s in Trinidad. And they were in a lot of ways, the reason they were formed was the guys wouldn't let them play. Mm-hmm. Their parents didn't want them hanging out with those guys. Mm-hmm. They're all young women and stuff, and a lot of them came from, well, their families just wanted them to go straight and get an education and so on, Yeah. So you had Girl Pat, and there was a group called Dem Boys, and their sisters all wanted to play, so they called themselves Dem Girls. and there was a group from Laventille, all girls, and it was a real sort of movement. So in a way, the women themselves pushed for inclusion. They didn't get it. They didn't just get invited in, you know. And I think I think there was never. I don't know that there was one band that really pushed for the inclusion of women. I think women broke through on their own. It was like one here, and one there, and one there. You know, it was like one at a time for a while in the 60s. And then in the 70s, boom, the wave came in. All of a sudden, they were included. Another band that was, there was another thing that happened was that kind of the light-skinned middle-class kids that wanted to play, they formed a group called Dixieland.
Mm-hmm.
You ever seen that band?
No, I haven't.
And it's like, it's really a trip. That Dixieland broke through a color line in a way by, and a social class line, and it was kind of a transition to like the band starting to get all mixed up and inclusive.
What
and the fact that they were there at all.
There's some other notable names that unicorn is the wrong word, but that are kind of out, like thinking like Pat Bishop. Is there a band called the United Sisters? Am I remembering right?
I don't know that group.
Not a steel band. I think they're like a soca group, like maybe from the 80s or something, where in Calypso Rose, there's a few in terms of the soca Calypso artistry that we look at. There's a few women who have sort of, and Pat Bishop in particular is a really notable figure in the steel band world, if I'm not mistaken, right? Like conducting a lot of large bands, and which
she was very active with especially with the classical music for the music festivals.
Yeah.
But she also got involved with helping bands rehearse for Panorama and other things. Yeah. I've actually when I was playing with Phase 2, she came by and directed the band one night.
Oh wow.
Back in 1986 or something.
Is she still alive?
No, Pat died a few years ago.
Okay, all right.
Yeah.
Can you talk about Tambu Bamboo and what? I've heard sort of the anecdote. I think I have the 30-second elevator pitch on what Tambu Bamboo is, but can you talk a little bit about the sort of what that is if somebody hears those two words?
Well, just what I do know about it is that the Tambu Bamboo kind of rose out of the banning of the drums. When the British banned, so it all goes back to those dates we're talking about that we don't know.
Yeah,
that we have to look up. But it was like you could cut bamboo lengths to different lengths, bamboo to different lengths, and get different pitches. And you hit them against each other and hit them against the ground. There's also you ever seen there's a kind of music in Venezuela that they invented with bamboo. It's called kitiplas, and they put a brick on the ground. They put bricks on the ground and they play the bamboo like this with their fists. Kudet, tuget, 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 tuget.
Oh, wow.
Tuget.
And they're two different pitches?
And it's rhythmic, and they have lots of players, and they're all tuned differently and stuff. So it's melodic, harmonic, everything, rhythmic. So the Tambu Bamboo was just another form of playing drums in a way. It was a replacement for drums, and I think the British found ways of discouraging that too. They said that it was they could use the bamboo for stick fighting.
Well, and did
bullshit, but
Well, did Tambu Bamboo? I mean, there is a form of martial arts in Trinidad called kalenda or stick fighting. There is that. And is Tambu Bamboo related at all to that stick fighting in any way? Do you know?
They play it. I think they play. As far as I know, let's look that one up. Yeah. All right. I believe that they play music for the kalinda, drums and perhaps Tambu Bamboo also. But I'm spacing out on it right now on that connection.
Yeah, again, I'm asking, and I think the best answer sometimes is I don't know. That's okay. What and you've done a lot of work with.
I forgot.
with calypso singers, and like David Rudder, and in particular your more recent album with Relator. calypso singing and the art of calypso was something that was like parallel to the development of the steel band world. When calypso tents during World War II, like leading up all around that whole thing. Can you talk a little bit about like what was happening parallel to the development of the steel band? It just in the musical culture, the way songs were being written and sung in Trinidad, and sort of now that they sort of connected with, maybe Lord Kitchener's not the exact moment where they met, but can you talk a little bit about those two tracks and sort of how they were feeding each other along the way, if at all?
Oh no, there's totally connected. I mean, if you go back to the birth of Pan, when we're talking about just the late 1930s, early 1940s, and how it was just rhythmic. Well, if we look at calypso music prior to that point, most of calypso music back in the 20s and 30s was much more so about just about the words than about the music. Often, the ex-tempo was still very much predominant in the music, and calypsonians would come out and their music would be very similar or the same melody, the same backing, the same, just different words. Ex-tempo is, the band will stay the same, and they two calypsonians will go at it and improvise verses. But calypso singing was very much like that too. There wasn't a lot of variety in the music. There wasn't a lot of different melody. There wasn't much harmonic exploration going on. Right. And, all this changed with Lord Kitchener. And Lord Kitchener started writing tunes in the late 30s. And he wrote some very simple tunes with 2-3 chords, and simple diatonic melodies. But he's a really talented musician, and he kept going, and he played guitar, he played upright bass. And in the late 40s, he went to England. And he discovered jazz. And there were a bunch of musicians in Trinidad over there that were, for that, he stayed there about 10 years in England. And Russ Henderson, the piano player, Fitzroy Coleman, the guitarist, Rupert Nurse was a saxophonist, Sterling Betancourt played pan and percussion, Russell Henderson played pan also. And these guys, and Mighty Terror was there some of the time, another great composer, calypso, and they played with the English jazz musicians, and you can hear the records that they can't come out of those studios. They're just like, they were so influenced by bebop. They brought in the big band sound happened there in London. Rupert Nurse and these guys and the horn players in London, they started using big horn sections on calypso records. Kitchener started writing long melodies with very involved sets of jazz chord changes.
Sorry to interrupt. So just as you say, the big band scene developed. I'm thinking of the album "London Is the Place for Me," and there's albums like it's not Bebop in the Jungle or Kitsch in the Jungle, and then there's another track that literally has the title Bebop in it. There's one that like the opening is like the chords from Big Ben, the bang bong bong bong, it's like he's literally quoting from the world he's in at this moment,
oh yeah.
And but when you say the big band scene and them sort of incorporating horns there, is that then what led to like later on, like now the sort of horn sections that are the synth horn sections that are happening? Is that related?
That's what I mean. Is what happened in the 50s is they brought the horn section sound into calypso. The sound of big horn sections and stuff that was happening in jazz big band music, they brought that over to the calypso and they started using sections.
Awesome to me. I don't know why I never made that connection. That's so cool.
Yeah, and the whole thing, he discovered bebop, and was really influenced by it. And Kitch was going to clubs. He was playing. He was a musician. He would sit in on bass at gigs. And there's a very interesting book about him, which is not really a biography, but Anthony Joseph wrote a book called Kitch, and it's actually his doctoral thesis.
Okay.
And it's a very interesting book. It's a fictional recreation of Kitch's life, but totally based on his life. It's not fiction at all, but he makes up all these things that all these real people said, about kitsch. Like Margie's talking, and it's her version of it's his wife, and it's her version of events at a given time or something like that. And he didn't interview her at all, so he can't,
Right.
But it's a beautifully written book and very revealing about the Kitchener's life over there in England. And
why
so
did he go to
these
England?
guys revolutionized the music, and the steel bands are now playing all these tunes.
Yeah.
Because Kitsch is recording and stuff, and the stuff's hits in Trinidad, even though he's in England.
Well, what was the reason? I mean, I'm going to ask the dumb question. Why did he go to England?
Bigger sea, be a littler fish in a bigger sea.
I mean, this was you said the late 40s, so post World War II, right? Like the war ends. Is that right? Or did he go?
Yeah, the war's over. He went over like in 48, I think.
Yeah. So, I mean, this is. When did so the war ended? I mean, I'm trying to think of like just the pure economics of what's happening in Trinidad after the war is over.
Yeah.
Like
Kitsch was getting popular, but that doesn't mean he wouldn't want to go over and look for work in a bigger pond. They go to the big city, and he went on the Windrush, which was they were just supposedly inviting West Indians to come over and help rebuild the country, and they didn't treat him very well. That's a big thing, that a whole return to understanding that whole period now that's happening now. They're talking about the Windrush generation and how they got screwed, and but Kitsch did well in England. He was popular, and then he came back and tore it up. All that music in the 60s and 70s, just incredible music. And you can hear all that jazz behind him, when you listen to stuff like Margie and Rainorama and, those in Pan and A minor and stuff. The man was a jazz musician.
When did who was the first Calypsonian to really start speaking about Pan in their lyrics? Was it Lord Kitchener, or were there others along the way?
I don't know. He did the most. He refined the art of. He was the first one to really refine the art of composing a song that all the bands would play at Panorama.
Yeah,
and just to make sure that they got the message, he would sing about Pan.
Yeah.
And so there was like. There was Pan and Harmony, there was more Pan, there was no Pan, there was Symphony in G, there was Pan Night and Day, Pan Here to Stay, Pan in A minor, Pan, the Toko Band, on and on and on.
He knew how to get his music played, just as a lesson to composers out there.
He was. Those are hits, They should be hits, Yeah. But it was like to the steel band was like, here, this is your tune for this year.
Yes, it was great music, but he also was a very good marketer. He didn't call them like, this is a song about milk. Like, it was like, no, this is about the lead pan, and you guys are going to play this at Panorama. Well, I don't want to keep you too much longer here, Andy, and I feel like I wish we could just have a regular weekly summit and just chew the fat on Pan stuff. But I want to bring it back to like high school. Josh Quillen walks in the room as a ninth grader and is like, and my band director says, "This is a steel band. We're gonna have a steel drum. You're gonna play in a steel band now." What would you recommend for a teacher from a pedagogical standpoint? Say you're a band director who's like, I'm a flute teacher, like I'm a flute player. I got hired to teach this band. This concert band, I have to do orchestra on the side, I have to do a study hall, and I have to run a steel band. What the hell am I doing? What would you say for somebody who's maybe completely ignorant to even what a steel band is, but has to teach it, or let me say this, gets to teach it, but has no idea where to start? What advice would you give them, both just from a historical context to wrap their head around what it is they're going to be talking, what their responsibilities are to a student with this instrument? And then, from there, what sort of further knowledge do you think they should start? How do they go down this path, I guess, is what do you recommend for them?
You know, it's funny. It sounds like you're asking me to give advice to people that don't really want to do
No,
this.
no, not at all, not at all. Because no,
I mean,
no, but
somebody who's what who
but
just
I
got obliged to do it.
no, well, but I'm asking this because I think the reality is that there's a ton of band programs in the United States that have pan in them now, and that's a good thing. That's a good problem to have. But the reality is I don't think that percussionists are always running them. I don't even think that. I mean, sometimes you just get tossed in, and sometimes as a percussionist, you don't even know what a steel drum is.
Yeah.
But you get into it, and I want somebody to come into it, have what's their first experience with it, and then even if they felt obliged and they didn't want to do it, all of a sudden are addicted. Like, how do we get somebody to make that switch really quick, and then how do you keep them on that path?
Well, anybody can learn how steel band music works if you know music. I used to tell people, you just use there's a few different beats you can use, simple stuff, and you just arrange the music yourself. Nowadays, that's not necessary. You can just buy some scores, and you can get every level of difficulty that's out there now. It's all available. Everybody's got YouTube videos up, from like middle school bands to university bands to all kind of professional situations. There. So you can watch and learn, and you can go check out another program that's happening. There's so many school programs that are happening now. I mean, but even without leaving your house, you can start to learn just by getting a score and looking at a video of the song. And seeing what's going on and listening and trying to. The next thing you should do is take an opportunity and go and play somewhere. Like get a pan. If you take one of your pans, practice, and go to one of these workshops and play with people. Or go to Trinidad and play, or go somewhere and play. I mean, there are a lot of places you can go play panorama now.
Yeah.
And like everybody that I know plays pan, does that. If they. It's like something you go through, I see you guys are doing it all the time. I've done it, and you got panorama in New York, Toronto, Montreal, London, Miami, St. Lucia, Trinidad, Grenada, Antigua.
St.
It's
Thomas,
all over
St.
the place.
Croix, like pretty much anywhere you go, you could probably find a panorama band
Take your
somewhere.
pick, and they're all adapted in different ways, and so on. And in terms of the difficulty of getting there or staying there and learning the music, some places are going to have scores in advance, and some places you're just going to have to go and find somebody to show you the music. Even in Trinidad, you can get the whole range of experience,
Well,
as you probably know.
What book? If your book list was amazingly thorough, and I really recommend anybody who is looking just to learn more about the history of systemic oppression in the Caribbean in particular, and how that affected musical cultures. Like, check out Andy's book list. He posted it on his Facebook page. But let's say, like, if you just want a good introduction to the steel band and sort of a basic, like, good launching pad, what's a good resource if you're going to buy one book? What's a good place to start?
I don't know what that would be. I don't think anybody's, as far as I know, there isn't. There are some things out there on how to start a steel band, but I don't know if I can say, well, this is the one. Or
sorry, not
like
a method book. I'm saying just in terms of like the book list that you lit. If you're just kind of curious about this history at all, like what's a good place to start? Not necessarily how to start a steel band, but.
Oh, you're talking about the books?
Yeah. Sorry.
The other thing?
Yeah.
You know what? The book I put at the top of the list. Mm-hmm. I put it there for a reason, because I think that's what it addresses directly what we're talking about right now with this.
Just say that
George Floyd.
Name of that book.
It was Michelle Alexander. It's called The New Jim Crow.
Okay.
And it's been out for several years, and it's already provoked a lot of the change in the discussion that we're having in America right now about mass incarceration. Mm. It's a big reason why it's on the table. And I think it's a really good place to start. One that I read that just blew me away recently was the book about Attica. It's called Blood on the Water,
Okay.
and Catherine Thompson, I think, is her name, and it's not what I would recommend as the next book. I'm just gonna say out of the books that I read in the last year or two, I mean that one just knocked me out so much because it just tore my heart out to this story, and if it'll tear down any illusions you have about our government not being ready to cover up anything that they do wrong,
Yeah.
and. And I think we need to start learning how to look at it from other points of view. I mean, one of the books I read really recently was the Indigenous People's History of the United States, and it really puts a lot of that author. She puts a lot of stuff in context about what's going on now, not only with African Americans and Indigenous people, but gun control. And the whole issue of why America is armed, and what this Second Amendment, the confusion about the Second Amendment and all that stuff has nothing to do with it. The real story of guns in America is that this country was created by settler colonialism, where they just threw the people out there and said, "You're the front line."
Yeah.
It wasn't a military takeover of everything. It was the settlers, the millions of people that just kept pushing and pushing and pushing, and America at one point there were states that required everybody to have a gun,
Yeah.
and the reason was they had to fight Indians and they had to control black people.
Yeah.
And that's our history, and then we've got to start facing up to this. This is the beginning. This is how our country was created. It was like everybody get a gun and be ready to catch slaves and go kill Indians. And until we come to grips with that, I think we're lost. We're lost. And that's why all this stuff, people, they don't want to talk about slavery. They don't want to talk about slavery. Yeah, we have to talk about slavery. It's a recent subject. And
it's like a person and a half ago. Like, it's not that long ago.
Yeah.
It's 1.5 people ago.
and Jim Crow is like, it was happening when I was a kid still.
Yeah.
And we just got another form of Jim Crow now with the war on drugs and all this stuff. It's a war on black people.
Yeah. I mean,
and that's why what Michelle Alexander is addressing. Basically, the new Jim Crow is the war on drugs, is what the argument that she's putting out.
Well, I think your piece of advice about going and playing in a band, I think, when I think about what changed my worldview, it's not like when I first played in a steel band or first started drilling a steel band in Brooklyn that I was like, oh, cool, I know everything there is to know about race relations in this country. And of course, it's all related to slavery. Like, it doesn't come that quickly it didn't come that quickly for me anyway. But I was sitting in a pan yard and watched cops walk right by me in Brooklyn and go right to the 13-year-old girl who's just practicing double tenors and search her bag. And walk right by me and then just keep searching everybody's bag. I'm the guy probably with the contraband in my bag, anyway.
Right.
And I see it, and it's like I know what it looks like, and I think it would be. I wonder how many people's worldviews would just be changed by just witnessing it. Let alone, I mean, forget about whether or not I should have ethically stood up and been like fought racism by confronting that cop in that moment. Yeah. Just observing what that looks like, I think, is really important. And if you can't just spend the $100 to get on a bus and come to Brooklyn over Labor Day and just sit in a yard, I'll give you the $100. I'll pay for it. How's that sound? 5 people. If 5 of you want to come, I'll each give you $100. Come on out and just sit in a yard, because that is going to teach you as much, if not more, than about how race relations are happening now. Like, forget about what happened hundreds of years ago. Just watch this interaction. Watch the cops walk right by me. I'm the only white guy in the yard.
Right.
Like, this is true. This is a true thing that happens, and it is related to Jim Crow. It's related to slavery. It's related to all that stuff. But it's been so far removed. But to now it's not like, they're coming in and the oppression isn't slave owners on a horse. It's cops just walking by me. That's what it is, and it's related. It's so hard, but you can't. I don't know how to teach people that. I don't know how to convince people to believe that until they see it for themselves.
Yeah. In a way, I think at the same time we need to get educated. We need to like educate ourselves somehow and to understand where we come from and what our real history is, and to stop listening to this bullshit that we tell ourselves about ourselves. What a great country we are. And at the same time, let's not forget that why we're playing in the steel band. We love the music, but we also love something else about it, and it's the way it brings people together, and the way it breaks down all those barriers. And this is we who play in steel band music know that we have something special there. That we're onto something. I think everybody feels it. That it's not the same as everything else. I mean, music is that on a general level. I'm singing in choirs and playing in a batucada and all these big ensembles and stuff like that, and orchestral, any kind. But we have something unique with the steel band. And one of the things when you said, "I want you to come and see the cop walk by me," to see the real Brooklyn. I would also say, I want you to look at this band.
Yeah, of course. Like,
look
yes.
At
sorry, I should have stated the obvious thing, Andy. Like, that's.
Look at all these young people playing music together, and look at all the inclusiveness of what's happening that you can come from outside with all your white privilege, and you can still walk in and be part of this band.
I like my
be a
instincts,
professor from Yale.
Yeah, totally. And I have these instincts when I hear. I understand why if somebody hears somebody say something maybe racially insensitive, why it feels good to yell at them and call them a racist or a bigot. But because of, I'm biased, I think, because of my experience in the steel band, where my instinct isn't to yell that at somebody. My instinct is to say, "Oh, just come with me. Come with me. I'm gonna get you some corn soup, and I'm gonna introduce you to Dougie, and we're just gonna chat." And it's not gonna solve everything now. But just trust me. You may think twice before you say that thing again, and you're gonna love. Like, you haven't had corn soup. Like, I wonder if it's that simple. Like, I don't know. Maybe it is. But that's been my instinct, and I think when you put your finger on the sort of, as it relates to class and race and all of the things, that inclusiveness is at the root of all of this in terms of the steel band, and I just really. I appreciate you talking with me about this stuff today. It really sort of, for me, was a nice 45 minutes to just highlight and draw a circle around that nugget of truth that I think we got to keep thinking about.
One of my favorite funny moments in my life happened out on a savannah in Trinidad. It was in between the bands, like 1986 at Panorama. And the backstory, I was being interviewed by Dalton Narell for Trinidad Television. It was live on TV, all right? And the backstory is I was playing with Phase 2 and Renegades. And when I went over by Renegades' yard, I was immediately introduced to a guy called Dr. Rat. And, it was like, he's in charge of the pan yard. He takes care of everything. You got any problem, you go to Dr. Rat. You need anything, you go to Dr. Rat. He's here to make sure you're cool, and so I had protection, everybody had protection, I mean, Dr. Rat was in charge of it, but
every band has a Dr. Rat that takes care of everybody. Yeah.
Well, it turns out Dr. Rat was he was this tall Rasta cat, and it turned out he had quite a reputation. I mean, he was really an old style pan man. He'd been to prison for various things, violence and drugs and all kind of shit, and stuff. He had quite a history behind him, and everybody knew about it too. He'd already been to prison and everything like that. So, but we got to be pretty tight friends. I was there every night and stuff like that. And so while I was being interviewed on live television, my buddy Dr. Rat shows up behind me and throws a big arm around me on live TV. And it was like, and I didn't even think about it, you know. And it was like this next day, everybody was like, oh man, the whole country's like, you and Dr. Rat are like that, boy. You know, one of the notorious people in Trinidad.
That's awesome.
A real bad John, old time, the baddest bad John of all the steel bands, you know, one of those guys. So, and in the old days, there were guys in the bands that had that rep. You know, there was like the enforcer on a team, but they were like the enforcer with a knife. You know,
well, there was a guy in Phase 2 when I played that. It was only after I was there for 3.5 weeks, and about 2 weeks into it, he was playing iron. His name was Mikey. I don't know if he's still there, but he was like the head iron guy. That year's was 2002, and he just one time just turned around and said hello, and he pulled up his shirt and there was a gun, and he said, "If you need anything, let me know." And he goes, and he said anything. And I'll
kill somebody for you.
It was my first time ever. I had never seen a gun that close before, and I was like,
yeah.
I just need the notes for the jam section. That's all I need, Mikey. I don't need a.
The place I experienced that first was South Africa, and I started playing there, and I started realizing that occasionally the driver that was driving us around might have a gun.
Yeah.
Some of these guys were carrying.
Well, there's some real stuff going on in Trinidad right now. I mean, there's a lot of unrest. I think there were some killings that happened in Port of Spain. Some cops shot some guys, and I know a few guys that play in the pan world that are cops, and I've been texting with them all day yesterday, and they're saying this one guy I know who was saying it's the worst he's ever seen in downtown. Like, but man, it's anyway.
It's terrible.
It's
the
chaos.
Violence thing is so terrible.
It's chaos, and but man, we're not going to solve that in the next 5 minutes. But Andy, I'm eternally grateful for. This is the hat trick now of our podcasts, and I'm really grateful for your time. I think this one in particular will be a good resource for anybody who just like has no clue what's going on, why the steel band came to what it is now.
They'll be real confused after this hour.
But I think in a good way. But in a good way, I think they will. I think the number of times people come up to me at a So Percussion concert and say, "I know that I love steel drums. They come from Hawaii." It's not and again, it's like it's not a bad thing. Like they're not being mean or stupid. It's just like, oh, whoa, okay, all right. You would have been closer if you said I love steel drums from Oklahoma. Like that would have been closer geographically than Hawaii. But if anything, it makes people understand that this history is way more complicated and nuanced and messy than just a flowered shirt on a cruise ship, and I think that's important. So thank you for that, buddy. I'll let you go. And until next time, I don't know what we'll chat about next time, but I'll look forward to it regardless.
All right, man. Same here.
Thank you, Andy. Take it easy.
Talk to you. Bye-bye.
Bye. Okay, I hope you enjoyed that conversation. This podcast was brought to you by Liquid Drum, liquiddrum.com, liquidrum.com, down in Waco, Texas. Hilarious percussion videos, good pedagogy. Check them out, liquiddrum.com. Also, dunleavypans.com, DUNLEAVY pans.com. Check them out. Kyle builds all the drums that I perform and teach on. And finally, paninmotion.com. Check them out. They're good. They're a great advocacy group, spreading the information about Pan all around the world. Check them out, paninmotion.com. All right, enjoyed it. We'll talk to you soon. Take care. Bye.